The crisp evening air of New York City wrapped around George as he strolled down the familiar paths of Central Park. At 80 years old, George had seen the city transform over decades. His neatly combed silver hair, classic brown trench coat, and polished shoes reflected an old-school elegance that was rare in a city constantly racing against time. In his right hand, he carried a sturdy wooden cane, not just a support for his aging legs, but also a trusted companion during his nightly walks. Beside him trotted Max, his loyal German shepherd. The dog's sleek black and tan coat glistened under the dim park lights, and his alert, intelligent eyes scanned their surroundings. George looked down at Max and chuckled softly. You know, boy, people always think it's me protecting you. But we both know it's the other way around. Max wagged his tail in response, his ears perking up at George's voice. They had been inseparable for the past 7 years, ever since George adopted Max from a local shelter. The dog had been labeled difficult by the shelter staff due to his high energy and strong will, but George had seen something special in him. Over time, the two had built a bond that went beyond words, a silent understanding that only true companions share. The park at night was a mix of serenity and mystery. The soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant hum of traffic created a soothing backdrop. The lampposts cast long shadows on the paths, and the occasional jogger or cyclist passed by with a nod or a wave. George enjoyed these quiet walks, a stark contrast to the bustling city life just beyond the park's borders. They allowed him to reminisce about the past and appreciate the present. As they approached the Bethesda fountain, George paused to take in the view. The angel statue at the center of the fountain seemed to glow under the moonlight. Beautiful, isn't it, Max? He mused. The dog sat obediently by his side, his tail sweeping the ground. It was moments like these that reminded George why he loved this city. Despite its chaos, New York had pockets of peace like this that felt almost magical. However, not all was as peaceful as it seemed. Unbeknownst to George, two shadowy figures lingered near a cluster of trees about 20 yards away. Dressed in dark hoodies and jeans, they whispered to each other, their eyes fixed on the elderly man and his dog. That old guy's gotta have something valuable on him, one of them muttered, shifting nervously. Just stay cool, the other hissed. He's alone except for the dog. We've got this. Back at the fountain, George stretched his arms and prepared to continue his walk. Come on, Max. Let's head home, he said, patting his thigh to signal the dog. Max stood and followed, his ears twitching slightly as he picked up faint noises from the direction of the trees. He turned his head briefly, his sharp instincts sensing something unusual. George noticed the subtle change in his companion's demeanor and frowned. What is it, boy? Something out there? He asked, scanning the area but seeing nothing out of the ordinary. Max gave a low growl, his body tense. George placed a reassuring hand on his head. Easy, Max. It's probably just a squirrel or something. Still, George couldn't shake off the unease that crept into his mind. The park felt different now, quieter, darker. The night's tranquility had shifted, replaced by an invisible tension. He adjusted his grip on his cane and quickened his pace slightly, trusting Max's instincts as much as his own. The pair continued their walk, their bond unspoken yet undeniable. Neither of them knew that tonight would test their courage and loyalty like never before. The air in Central Park that evening carried a deceptive calm. The faint sound of leaves rustling in the breeze was almost soothing, but for George and Max, the peace was about to shatter. As George walked along the path near the Ramble, a more secluded area of the park, the shadows seemed to deepen. The city's distant hum faded, leaving behind an eerie quiet. Unbeknownst to George, the two men who had been observing him earlier were no longer just standing idle. They moved with calculated precision, keeping to the darker edges of the path. Their faces were obscured by hoodies, their hands tucked into their pockets. While one seemed hesitant, glancing around nervously, the other appeared more confident, his eyes locked on George. This guy's old. He won't even see it coming. The confident one whispered to his partner. "I don't know, man," the other replied, his voice shaky. "That dog looks serious. Maybe we should pick someone else." "Don't be a coward," came the sharp response. "We'll be in and out before he even knows what happened." As they trailed George, their steps were quiet but not quiet enough. Max's ears twitched and his body stiffened. The large shepherd stopped in his tracks, his gaze fixed behind them. George noticed and turned slightly, peering into the darkness. "Max? What's wrong, boy?" George asked, his voice calm but tinged with concern. Max growled low in his throat, his hackles rising. The sound sent a shiver down George's spine. He tightened his grip on his cane, his senses suddenly more alert. From the shadows, the hesitant man whispered again, "That dog's onto us. Let's just go." But his companion refused to back down. "Stay put. I'll handle the dog." George, unaware of their exact location but fully aware of the potential danger, spoke softly to Max. "Easy, boy. Stay close." The park now felt oppressively quiet, the kind of silence that weighed on the chest. George's eyes darted around, looking for any sign of movement, but the dim light of the lampposts offered little visibility. Meanwhile, the two men crept closer, using the cover of trees to shield their approach. The confident one whispered to his partner, "You flank left. I'll go straight for him." As the hesitant man reluctantly moved to the side, George and Max continued forward, each step slower than the last. George's heart pounded in his chest, though he maintained an outward composure. He had lived through enough challenges in his life to know that panicking would do no good. Finally, a sound, a twig snapping, broke the tension. George spun around, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but firm. There was no answer, only the faint shuffle of movement. Max barked sharply, the sound echoing through the still night. It wasn't the bark of a playful dog. It was a warning, clear and unmistakable. In the distance, the hesitant man froze, fear flickering in his eyes. "We should go," he whispered again. But his companion ignored him, stepping forward with a sneer. "Old man," the confident one called out, his tone mocking. "How about you hand over whatever you've got, and no one gets hurt?" George turned fully to face the voice, his cane now gripped like a weapon. Max stood at his side, his posture protective and ready. "If you know what's good for you, you'll turn around and walk away," George said, his voice unwavering. The man laughed, taking a step closer. "Oh, tough guy. Huh? You think that stick is going to save you?" George's eyes narrowed. "I don't think. I know." For a moment, the park was silent again, the tension hanging thick in the air. Then, the man lunged. The lunge was sudden, quick, and calculated. The man surged forward with the confidence of someone who had done this before, his hoodie obscuring most of his face, but his intent was clear. George, however, was not the frail and helpless man the attacker had assumed. Max reacted first. A fierce bark erupted from the German shepherd as he positioned himself between George and the attacker. His powerful body tensed like a coiled spring, and his sharp teeth gleamed under the dim park light. Without hesitation, Max lunged, intercepting the man before he could reach George. The attacker barely had time to raise his arm before Max's jaws clamped down on the sleeve of his jacket, his growls a terrifying warning. "Get this mutt off me," the man shouted, struggling to shake Max off. George took a step back, gripping his cane tightly. His heart raced, but his mind remained clear. He wasn't just going to stand there and let these men dictate the outcome. The second man, still hesitant but feeling pressured by his partner's plight, stepped into view. "Hey, let the dog go," he yelled, though his voice lacked conviction. He waved a pocket knife in the air, clearly trying to intimidate George. George stood his ground, raising his cane in front of him like a fencing sword. His voice carried the weight of experience and defiance. "You'd better think twice before coming any closer," he warned, his sharp gaze fixed on the man. The hesitant attacker wavered, his grip on the knife faltering. "We just want his wallet or something, man. Let's get out of here," he pleaded with his companion. But the first man, still pinned by Max's relentless grip, was too enraged to listen. "Help me, you idiot," he barked, trying to kick at the dog. But Max was too well trained to be thrown off so easily. George seized the moment. With a quick, deliberate move, he swung his cane with surprising strength, aiming for the knife in the second man's hand. The blow struck true, sending the weapon clattering to the ground. The man stumbled back, clutching his wrist in pain. "You've picked the wrong old man tonight," George said, his voice calm but full of authority. The second man's courage evaporated entirely. He glanced at his partner, still struggling under Max's weight, and then back at George. "This isn't worth it," he muttered before turning and bolting into the shadows of the park. Now alone, the first man tried one last desperate move to free himself. "Stupid dog," he shouted, reaching into his pocket. But before he could pull anything out, Max adjusted his grip, pinning the man's arm to the ground with precision. His growls deepened, a clear signal that further resistance would not end well. George stepped forward, his cane raised again, and looked down at the man. "You thought you could prey on someone weaker, didn't you?" he said, his voice steady and sharp. "But here's the thing. I've faced worse than the likes of you." The man stopped struggling, finally realizing he was beaten. His breathing was ragged, his face pale under the dim light. Okay, he gasped. "Call your dog off. I give up." George nodded at Max. "Good boy," he said, his tone soft but commanding. "Release." Max immediately obeyed, stepping back but remaining alert, his eyes locked on the man. George took out his phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I'm in Central Park, near the Ramble," he told the dispatcher. "I've been attacked, but I've got one of them detained. Please send officers quickly." As he hung up, George looked back at the man, who was now sitting up, clutching his arm. "You should be ashamed," George said, his voice low but full of conviction. "Attacking someone you thought couldn't fight back. Let this be a lesson to you." Within minutes, the distant wail of police sirens filled the air. Max stood by George's side, his posture still protective, while the man on the ground hung his head in defeat. The moments leading up to the confrontation replayed vividly in George's mind as he stood there, keeping a vigilant eye on the subdued attacker. His heart was still pounding, and adrenaline surged through his veins. Max, however, was not relaxing yet. The German shepherd's ears were pricked, and his posture remained tense, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows of the park. George gave Max a reassuring pat on the head, though he too felt uneasy. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly, his voice carrying both curiosity and caution. Max didn't respond with his usual wag of the tail. Instead, he let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on the far end of the path. "Stay sharp, Max," George muttered. He turned to the attacker, who was still sitting on the ground, clutching his arm. "If you've got more friends out there, I suggest you call them off now," George said sternly. "I swear, it's just the two of us," the man replied, his voice shaking. "I don't want any more trouble." Max's growl deepened, and he took a step forward, his body rigid with focus. George squinted into the darkness, his pulse quickening as he caught a faint rustle in the bushes about 20 feet away. For a moment, he thought it might be a squirrel or some other harmless creature, but Max's behavior told him otherwise. "Someone's there," George said under his breath, his grip tightening on his cane. Suddenly, the second man, the one who had fled earlier, emerged from the shadows, panting heavily. His hands were raised in the air, and he looked as though he might have reconsidered his decision to run. "I'm done, man," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I don't want any part of this anymore. Just don't let that dog near me." Max barked sharply at the man's approach, his deep voice reverberating through the still night. George raised his cane slightly, signaling for the man to stop where he was. "That's far enough," he said firmly. "You stay right there until the police arrive." The man froze, his face pale under the dim light. "Fine, fine," he stammered, his eyes darting nervously between George and Max. "Just keep that dog back." "He's a monster." George allowed himself a faint smile. "Max isn't a monster. He's a protector. And tonight, you gave him a reason to do his job." The two attackers were now subdued, but Max's posture suggested the danger wasn't entirely over. His growls softened but didn't disappear, and he remained standing as if anticipating another threat. George glanced around the park again, his senses heightened by the adrenaline coursing through him. The police sirens grew louder, a comforting sound that signaled help was close. George took a deep breath, steadying himself. He looked down at Max, whose loyalty and instincts had saved him from what could have been a devastating encounter. "You did good, Max," George said softly, kneeling slightly to meet the dog's gaze. Max responded by pressing his nose gently against George's hand, a silent exchange of trust and affection. The sound of footsteps approached, and two NYPD officers appeared, flashlights cutting through the darkness. One officer called out, "Sir, are you okay?" George straightened and nodded. "We're fine, thanks to Max," he replied. He gestured toward the attackers. These two thought they could mug an old man and his dog. Max had other plans. The officers approached cautiously, placing the men in handcuffs while another officer questioned George about the events. As George recounted the night's events, he couldn't help but glance at Max, who sat patiently by his side, his tail wagging slightly now that the immediate threat was over. "You've got one heck of a dog there," one officer said, scratching Max behind the ears. "If only all New Yorkers had a partner like him." George smiled. "He's not just a dog. He's family." The night's danger had passed, but the bond between George and Max had only deepened. They had faced the worst together and come out stronger, a testament to courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable connection between a man and his best friend. The tense atmosphere lingered in the air, a fragile silence enveloping the scene as the two attackers were restrained by the police. George felt the weight of the night's events pressing on him, but he stood tall, his cane in hand and Max still alert by his side. Hours earlier, when the attackers had first made their move, George had relied on instincts honed over a lifetime. He wasn't just an elderly man walking his dog. He was a retired military veteran, a man who had faced adversity before. He knew the value of staying calm under pressure. The confrontation had begun when the bolder of the two men stepped into the dim light of the park path, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie. "Look, old man," he said, his voice steady but laced with malice. "Hand over your wallet, your phone, whatever you've got, and this'll all be over." George met the man's gaze, his sharp eyes assessing the threat. "You think you can scare me?" he replied, his voice firm. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The attacker laughed mockingly, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't expecting resistance, let alone from someone George's age. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," the man said. "An old guy and his mutt. Now, hand it over before things get ugly." Max let out a low, menacing growl, stepping forward to stand protectively in front of George. His body was tense, his ears pinned back, and his teeth bared. The second man, who had hung back in the shadows, shifted uneasily. "I don't know, man," he muttered to his companion. "That dog looks like trouble." "Shut up," the bolder man snapped, keeping his eyes on George. "It's just a dog." But George knew better. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a highly trained protector, capable of assessing danger and acting decisively. George had spent years training Max, teaching him not only obedience, but also how to respond in moments of crisis. George tightened his grip on his cane and said, "You've got one chance to walk away. Take it." The bold attacker sneered and took a step forward. "You're bluffing." Before George could respond, Max acted. In a blur of motion, the German shepherd lunged, his powerful body colliding with the attacker. The man stumbled backward, crying out as Max latched onto his arm, his growls vibrating through the air. The second attacker panicked. "Let him go, man," he shouted, pulling a small knife from his pocket and advancing toward George. But George was ready. With a swift, calculated movement, he swung his cane, striking the man's wrist and sending the knife clattering to the ground. "Stay down," George commanded, his voice sharp with authority. The bold attacker struggled against Max, but the dog's grip was unyielding. The man's attempts to shake him off only made Max growl louder, his teeth firmly locked onto the man's jacket sleeve. "Get this dog off me," the attacker yelled, his bravado replaced by panic. George pointed his cane at the second man, who was now clutching his wrist in pain. "If you even think about moving, you'll regret it," George said. The man hesitated, looking between George and Max. "This isn't worth it," he muttered, backing away into the shadows. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving his partner to face the consequences alone. Max held his position until George gave the command. "Release," he said firmly. Max immediately let go, stepping back but keeping his eyes on the subdued man. George knelt beside Max and stroked his head. "Good boy," he said softly. "You did well." The attacker sat on the ground, clutching his arm and glaring at George. "You'll pay for this," he spat. George smirked. "No, you'll pay for thinking you could take advantage of the wrong person." The park was quieter now, the tension from the earlier attack settling like a weight in the air. The bold attacker sat on the ground, clutching his arm, while Max maintained a steady, watchful stance. George, though shaken, stood tall. At 80 years old, he wasn't about to let anyone see him as weak or incapable. His entire life had been a testament to resilience, and tonight would be no exception. George took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the worn handle of his wooden cane. The attacker looked up at him with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "You think you're tough, old man? You got lucky with that dog," the man sneered. George tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing. "Luck? No, son. This isn't luck. It's preparation." He took a step closer, his cane tapping the ground firmly. "I've seen my share of cowards like you. Always thinking the world owes them something, always underestimating the ones who've lived long enough to know better." The man didn't respond. He looked away, avoiding George's eyes, but his defiance hadn't completely faded. George wasn't finished. "You thought I'd be an easy target," he continued. "An old man, alone, with a dog. But let me tell you something. You're not the first person to look at me and think I'm fragile, and you won't be the last." Max, as if understanding George's words, let out a soft growl, his eyes still fixed on the subdued attacker. George knelt briefly beside his dog, giving him a reassuring pat. "We're okay, Max," he murmured. "You did your job." Standing again, George looked at the man on the ground. "You want to know the truth? I don't need Max to protect me. He's here because he's family. But I've faced bigger challenges in my life than you, and I've walked away from every one of them stronger." The attacker shifted uncomfortably, the weight of George's words pressing on him. He wasn't dealing with just any elderly man. This was someone who had lived through hardship, someone who had earned every gray hair and every wrinkle with a lifetime of perseverance. Suddenly, George's mind flashed back to his younger days. He remembered the grueling training during his time in the military, the countless hours spent honing his skills and learning to adapt under pressure. He thought of the family he had built, the losses he had endured, and the victories he had celebrated. Each of those moments had shaped him into the man standing there now, a man who would not back down. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, signaling that the police were close. George turned to Max, his voice softening. "Hear that, buddy? Help's on the way." Max wagged his tail slightly, his ears twitching at the sound, but he didn't relax entirely. The dog's loyalty and vigilance were unwavering, a testament to the bond he shared with George. Moments later, 2 NYPD officers arrived on the scene, their flashlights cutting through the dim light of the park. One officer approached George while the other moved to secure the subdued attacker. "Sir, are you all right?" the officer asked, his tone professional but concerned. George nodded, standing straight. "We're fine, thanks to Max here," he said, gesturing to his dog. These men thought they could take advantage of an old man. They learned otherwise. The officer gave Max an approving glance before turning back to George. "Sounds like your dog deserves a medal," he said with a smile. George chuckled softly. "He's earned more than a medal tonight." As the officers detained the attacker and gathered statements, George felt a deep sense of pride, not just in Max but in himself. Despite the odds, he had stood his ground, proving that resilience and courage don't fade with age. The night had tested him, but it had also reaffirmed what he had always known. Strength comes from within, and it grows with every challenge overcome. The evening's tranquility had long been shattered, but the danger wasn't entirely over. As the police officers secured the bold attacker and began radioing for backup to track down his accomplice, the subdued man saw an opportunity to retaliate. He tensed suddenly, his hand inching toward the inside of his jacket. Max noticed the movement before anyone else. His ears snapped forward, and a deep, guttural growl erupted from his throat, freezing everyone in their tracks. "Max?" George said, his tone low but steady. He trusted Max's instincts implicitly, and the dog's reaction confirmed that the situation wasn't resolved yet. The officer closest to the attacker shouted, "Hey, hands where I can see them." He stepped closer, but the man moved quickly, pulling a small, concealed blade from his jacket pocket and lunging toward the officer. Before George or the officer could react, Max surged forward like a force of nature. His powerful body launched into the air, intercepting the attacker mid-lunge. The impact sent the man sprawling to the ground, the knife clattering harmlessly away. "Max, hold," George commanded firmly. Max obeyed instantly, pinning the man's arm to the ground with his front paws while emitting a warning growl that vibrated through the air. The attacker froze, his defiance melting into fear as he stared into the intense eyes of the German shepherd. The officer quickly retrieved the knife and cuffed the man's hands behind his back. "That's one hell of a dog you've got there," he said, glancing at George. "He just saved my skin." George nodded, his expression a mix of pride and relief. "He's trained to protect the people he cares about," he said simply, kneeling beside Max to check on him. "You okay, boy?" Max wagged his tail slightly, his tension easing now that the immediate threat had passed. He looked at George, his tongue lolling out in a gesture that almost seemed like reassurance. The subdued attacker, now thoroughly restrained, grumbled under his breath, "It's just a dog. I wasn't gonna hurt anyone." The officer scoffed. "That just a dog took you down before you could do anything stupid. Be glad he's well trained, or you'd have more than your pride hurt." As more officers arrived to secure the scene and take the attackers into custody, George felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The adrenaline that had kept him steady was beginning to fade, leaving him acutely aware of his age and the weight of the night's events. One of the newer officers approached George and Max, kneeling to meet the dog at eye level. "You've got a hero here," she said, scratching Max behind the ears. Not many dogs would have acted so decisively and so controlled. George gave a small smile, his voice softening. "Max isn't just any dog. He's family, and he's my partner. I wouldn't be here without him tonight." The officer nodded. "Well, he deserves a treat, or a dozen." George chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "He'll get more than that when we get home." As the officers led the attackers away and the park began to return to its usual quiet, George stood with Max by his side, watching the scene unfold. The bond between them felt stronger than ever. In that moment, George realized that while he had always trusted Max, tonight had shown him just how deep their connection ran. "Let's go home, Max," George said, patting his dog on the head. "We've done enough for one night." Max wagged his tail and fell into step beside George as they began their walk home, leaving behind the echoes of a night they would both remember forever. The sharp wail of sirens grew louder, bouncing off the trees and paths of Central Park. George stood steady, his hand resting gently on Max's head, as the bright red and blue lights illuminated the once shadowed paths. 2 squad cars screeched to a halt at the edge of the ramble, and 4 officers quickly exited, scanning the area with flashlights and a sense of urgency. One officer, a tall man with a firm demeanor and sharp eyes, approached George. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked, his tone professional but tinged with concern. George gave a small nod. "I'm fine, thanks to Max here," he replied, patting his German shepherd on the back. These 2 thought I'd be an easy target. They learned the hard way. Max sat at George's side, his body still alert but calmer now. The dog's piercing gaze followed the officer's movements as they approached the subdued attacker. One officer crouched to secure the man's cuffs, while another surveyed the area. "You've got yourself a real protector," the officer said. Glancing at Max, "He kept them at bay until we got here?" "He did more than that," George replied with a faint smile. "Max intercepted the first one before he could even reach me, and when the second pulled a knife, Max shut him down before anyone got hurt." Another officer, a younger woman with a friendly yet focused air, leaned down to Max's level. "You're a hero, aren't you?" she said, scratching behind his ears. Max wagged his tail briefly, enjoying the attention but not breaking his vigilance. As the officers worked, George recounted the events in detail. His voice was steady as he described the attackers' approach, their threats, and how Max had acted instinctively to protect him. The officers listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes in their notebooks. "So, they didn't expect resistance," the lead officer summarized, glancing at the cuffed man, who sat on the ground glaring at Max. "They figured you'd be an easy mark." George nodded. "That's right. But they underestimated me, and Mac." The officer chuckled. "Clearly, a lot of people would have panicked in your situation. You kept your cool." George shrugged slightly. "Panicking never helps. Besides, I knew Max wouldn't let anything happen to me." Nearby, one officer radioed in for transport to take the attackers to the precinct. The younger of the 2 men, now visibly shaken, muttered under his breath, "I told you we shouldn't have done this. I told you the dog was trouble." His bolder accomplice sneered. "Shut up. It's just a dog." Hearing this, the younger officer smirked and gestured toward Max. "That just a dog had you both down before we got here. If I were you, I'd be a little more grateful it wasn't worse." Max turned his head briefly, as if understanding the officer's words, and George chuckled. "You're right," he said, looking down at his dog. "Max could have done a lot worse. But he knows when enough is enough." As the attackers were loaded into the squad cars, the lead officer returned to George. "You're lucky to have Max, sir," he said. "Most people wouldn't have made it out of this unscathed." George smiled faintly. "It's not luck, officer. It's trust. Max and I have been through a lot together. He knows I'd do the same for him." The officer nodded, impressed. "Well, he's earned more than a pat on the back. If there's anything you need from us, don't hesitate to ask." Another officer handed George a card. "Here's our contact information, just in case you think of anything else." As the squad cars pulled away, leaving the park quiet once more, George looked around at the familiar surroundings. The danger was gone, but the night had left its mark. He knelt beside Max, meeting the dog's intelligent gaze. "You did good, buddy," George said softly. "Let's head home." Max wagged his tail, his body finally relaxing as they turned and began their walk back. The city's distant hum grew louder as they neared the edge of the park, but for George, the night wasn't just another chapter in his walks. It was a testament to the bond between a man and his dog, a bond forged in trust, loyalty, and unshakable courage. The morning after the harrowing events in Central Park, George woke to an unexpected sound, his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Blinking away sleep, he reached for it, only to find a flood of messages and missed calls. A glance at the screen showed texts from friends, neighbors, and even acquaintances he hadn't spoken to in years. "George, is it true what I read about you and Max? You're all over the news, man. What a story. Central Park heroes. That's you and Max. Confused, George turned on the television, where a local news anchor was already recounting the events of the previous night. An incredible story of bravery unfolded last night in Central Park, the anchor said, her tone lively. 80-year-old George Bennett and his German shepherd, Max, thwarted an attempted mugging. Thanks to Max's swift actions and George's composure, the situation ended without serious injury. Police have confirmed that the two suspects are now in custody. George sat back, shaking his head with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "Well, Max," he said, looking at the dog lounging at his feet. "Seems like you're famous." Max perked up at his name, wagging his tail slightly as if he understood. By noon, the news had spread far beyond George's immediate circle. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate him, bringing baked goods and pats for Max. One woman even brought a custom-made collar tag that read "Hero of Central Park." "You and Max saved the day, George," she said warmly. "You deserve all the recognition." George accepted the attention with humility, always redirecting the praise to Max. "He's the real hero," George insisted, rubbing the dog's head. "I was just holding the cane." The story continued to grow. A journalist from a local paper showed up at George's door, eager to hear the tale firsthand. George recounted the events in his usual understated way, focusing on Max's bravery and their bond. The journalist, visibly moved, promised to feature their story prominently. By the next day, George and Max were more than local heroes. They had captured the city's heart. The story appeared in newspapers, online blogs, and even a brief segment on a national morning show. People were captivated not just by the drama of the confrontation, but by the extraordinary relationship between an elderly man and his fiercely loyal dog. A week later, Central Park was buzzing with an unusual crowd. What was normally a space for joggers, dog walkers, and tourists had transformed into a gathering place for reporters, park officials, and curious onlookers. A small stage had been set up near the Bethesda fountain, and a modest plaque covered by a cloth stood nearby. George, dressed in his usual trench coat and fedora, stood quietly to the side with Max. The park officials had insisted on holding a small ceremony in their honor, but George had agreed only on the condition that it wouldn't be overly elaborate. As the event began, a representative from the city stepped forward to speak. "Today, we honor George Bennett and his remarkable dog, Max, who demonstrated extraordinary courage and loyalty," she said, her voice carrying through the crowd. "Their actions remind us of the power of bravery and the unbreakable bond between humans and their pets." She pulled back the cloth to reveal the plaque, which read, "In honor of George Bennett and Max for their courage, loyalty, and bravery in protecting our community. Central Park Heroes, December 2024." The crowd erupted into applause, and Max barked once as if to join in. George, ever modest, tipped his hat slightly in acknowledgement before kneeling beside Max. "This is for you, buddy," he said softly. Max responded with a wag of his tail and a gentle nudge of George's hand. The recognition didn't change George or Max's routines. They still took their nightly walks, though now they were often greeted with waves and smiles from passers-by who recognized them as the heroes of Central Park. For George, the experience had reinforced what he already knew. Life is full of unexpected challenges, but with loyalty, courage, and trust, even the toughest moments can be faced head-on. Weeks after the ceremony, life had settled back into its usual rhythm for George and Max. They continued their nightly walks through Central Park, albeit with more people stopping to greet them along the way. Max, now somewhat of a celebrity, handled the extra attention with the same poise and loyalty he always had. One evening, George and Max made their way to the Bethesda fountain, the site of their regular pause during their walks. This time, however, the area felt different. The plaque installed in their honor was mounted nearby, surrounded by a small garden of fresh flowers left by park visitors who had been inspired by their story. George stood in front of the plaque, his cane planted firmly in the ground, and read the words again. "In honor of George Bennett and Max for their courage, loyalty, and bravery in protecting our community. Central Park Heroes, December 2024, he let out a soft chuckle and looked down at Max. "We've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" he said. Max wagged his tail and gave a gentle bark, his eyes bright and focused on George. As they stood there, a family approached, their young daughter holding a bouquet of flowers. "Excuse me," the father said politely. "Are you George Bennett? The one from the story?" George smiled. "That's me," he replied. The little girl stepped forward timidly, clutching the bouquet. "These are for you and Max," she said in a small voice. George knelt carefully, accepting the flowers with a warm smile. "Thank you, young lady," he said. "That's very kind of you." The girl then crouched to pet Max, who leaned into her touch, his tail wagging softly. "He's a real hero," she said, her eyes wide with admiration. "He is," George agreed, his voice gentle. "And he's also my best friend." The family stayed a moment longer, taking a photo with George and Max before thanking them again and walking away. George straightened, holding the bouquet in one hand and his cane in the other, and watched as the family disappeared down the path. "Heroes, huh?" he murmured, glancing down at Max. "I never thought I'd see the day." As they continued their walk, George reflected on everything that had happened since that fateful night. He had always thought of himself as just another New Yorker, blending into the city's bustling rhythm. But now, he realized that moments of courage and loyalty, no matter how small they might seem, could leave a lasting impact. When they reached the edge of the park, George turned back for one last look at the fountain and the plaque gleaming under the park's soft lights. It wasn't just a marker of what had happened. It was a reminder of what they had overcome together. "Come on, Max," George said, tapping his cane lightly on the ground. "Let's head home. Tomorrow's another adventure." Max trotted beside him, his posture relaxed yet confident, as if he, too, understood the significance of their journey. Together, they walked into the city's glow, a man and his dog, forever bound by a night that had shown the world the strength of their bond. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.